"Get on the ground now!" The command ripped through the air like a gunshot. Shoppers froze mid-step as a young black teen's backpack hit the pavement. The sound echoed across the mall parking lot. Car alarms chirped, a soda can rolled beneath a car, and somewhere in the chaos a terrified voice pleaded, "I didn't steal anything. Please, my receipt's right there." It was a hot Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the air shimmered above the asphalt and families hustled between stores for weekend sales. Near the entrance of Rivergate Mall, 17-year-old Elijah Carter stood surrounded by two uniformed officers, Officer Derek Collins and Sergeant Mike Reynolds. He had been on his way home after buying a pink teddy bear for his little sister's birthday. His hoodie was gray, his jeans clean, his expression confused. But none of that mattered now. Reynolds' heavy boots crunched toward him. "Hands where I can see them." Elijah stammered. "I didn't." Collins shoved him hard in the shoulder. "Did I ask for your story?" "Face down." The boy stumbled and fell to his knees. Asphalt scraped his palms as he tried to steady himself, but before he could speak again, Reynolds pressed a knee into his back. Gasps rose from the growing crowd. Someone muttered, "It's just a kid." Another voice, sharp and careless, replied, "He probably did it." Phones appeared like weapons of silence. Recording, not intervening. Mothers pulled their children closer. A mall guard watched from the door but did nothing. The air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and shame. Elijah's cheek pressed against the ground, his reflection distorted in an oil stain. His chest heaved. "Please," he gasped, "I didn't do anything." Reynolds smirked. "Then you won't mind spending the night figuring that out." Collins tightened the plastic zip ties around Elijah's wrists until they bit into his skin. The sound of the plastic ratcheting shut was louder than his protests. "Resisting arrest," Collins muttered for the camera he assumed was recording from his own chest. The boy's shopping bag tipped over in the scuffle. A small pink teddy bear rolled out, still wrapped with a ribbon. The laughter that had rippled through the crowd faded instantly. The truth sat there, innocent and undeniable, and yet no one moved. Not a single hand reached out. They dragged Elijah past the automatic mall doors as the crowd parted like frightened water. His shoes scraped the ground. His face was red, humiliated, streaked with dirt and disbelief. A woman whispered, "He's just a child," but her voice vanished beneath the sound of the police radio crackling with false authority. Reynolds looked back at the silent witnesses and said, "Maybe next time he'll think twice before stealing." The doors slid shut behind them with a hiss, sealing the moment like a coffin. The teddy bear lay abandoned on the asphalt, a bright spot of color in the dull gray scene, and then, over the image of flashing lights and the trembling boy being shoved into the patrol car, the narrator's voice cut through, calm and foreboding. They thought it was just another arrest no one would question, but someone was watching, and their next move would make headlines across the nation. Elijah Carter had grown up in the kind of neighborhood where dreams were often smaller than the fences that surrounded them. The cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights didn't make the news, but the people who lived there carried quiet dignity. None more than Tanya Carter, Elijah's mother. Tanya worked double shifts as a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital. Her hands were calloused from lifting patients and her eyes carried the fatigue of long nights, but she never let her son see defeat in her posture. Every morning, before she rushed out the door, she left him a note on the kitchen table. "Keep your head up, baby. Remember who you are." Elijah did. He was the kind of kid teachers trusted with the classroom key. A straight-A student who volunteered to tutor younger children after school, he was already accepted into a prestigious pre-law summer program at the local university. His guidance counselor had written in his recommendation letter, "He will not just learn the law, he will redefine what justice means." But behind his achievements was struggle. To help his mother with bills, Elijah worked part-time at a cafe near the bus terminal. He made lattes, wiped tables, and memorized court cases on his breaks. When other teens joked about cars or parties, he studied cases about wrongful convictions and police misconduct. He dreamed of standing in a courtroom one day, wearing a suit that wasn't borrowed, defending someone who couldn't defend themselves. It was more than ambition. It was purpose. Every night when Tanya returned from her shift, she and Elijah would sit on the couch with the TV playing quietly in the background. Together they watched old documentaries about courtroom heroes, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, and modern civil rights attorneys who had fought impossible battles. Tanya would rest her hand on his shoulder and say softly, "When the world pushes you down, don't shout. Stand taller. The truth makes its own noise." Those words became his armor. His little sister, Amara, was 7, full of laughter and light. Her room was lined with second-hand toys from thrift stores, but her favorite thing in the world was her brother's bedtime stories. Elijah promised that one day he'd buy her a brand-new teddy bear, the softest one in the store. That day had finally come. His mom's paycheck had just cleared, but it was already spoken for. Rent, food, and bills. So Elijah used his cafe tips to surprise Amara. He went to Rivergate Mall, picked out the biggest pink bear he could find, and paid for it with his own money. The cashier smiled at him. He smiled back. It should have been an ordinary day. It wasn't. At the same time Elijah was walking through the parking lot, 2 police officers were circling the area after a call came in. A mall employee had reported a suspicious teen with a backpack, loitering in electronics. They hadn't checked the cameras or verified the claim. They just made the call, and that was all it took. Officer Derek Collins was the first to respond. In his 10 years on the force, he'd earned medals for bravery, but also a stack of complaints from citizens who claimed he'd used unnecessary force. Those complaints never made it far. His record stayed clean, thanks to friends higher up the chain. To the public, he was the officer who kept the streets in line. Behind that reputation stood Sergeant Mike Reynolds, his mentor and self-proclaimed hero. Reynolds knew how to play politics. He attended community breakfasts, shook hands with local business owners, and smiled for cameras. But under the surface, he was arrogant, temperamental, and untouchable. He saw the city not as a community, but as territory. Collins followed his lead like a shadow. When they saw Elijah leaving the mall with a backpack and a shopping bag, they didn't see a student. They saw a suspect. "Looks like our lucky day," Reynolds said as he adjusted his vest. Collins laughed. "Let's make this quick. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't check the receipt. They saw brown skin, nervous eyes, and a backpack, and in their minds that was enough." By the time they reached him, Elijah was unlocking his bike. He didn't even notice them until Reynolds' voice boomed. "Hey, you! Step away from the bike." He turned, startled. "Sir?" Collins' hand was already on his holster. "Don't move." Witnesses would later say it happened too fast. 1 minute, the boy was standing there holding a stuffed animal. The next, he was on the ground, surrounded by flashing lights and shouted orders. When Tanya got the call hours later, she was at work. The nurse's station went silent as her phone slipped from her hand. She didn't cry, not yet. She simply grabbed her coat and whispered, "My son's been arrested." By the time she reached the station, Elijah was sitting in an interrogation room with swollen wrists and a trembling voice. But the moment that would change everything hadn't arrived yet. Somewhere across town, as the videos of the arrest began spreading online, a quiet figure watched the footage on a tablet. Special Agent Rebecca Lane, a federal investigator reviewing cases of civil rights violations. She replayed the video twice, eyes narrowing at the sight of the officers' faces. "Reynolds," she muttered. "Not again." And while the city dismissed the arrest as routine, something had been set in motion that afternoon. Something far bigger than anyone in that parking lot could imagine. Later, when Tanya stood before cameras, her voice shaking but steady, she said, "I taught my son that dignity doesn't shout. It waits. Then it roars." The roar was coming. The crowd at Rivergate Mall grew by the minute. Mothers, teens, store clerks, everyone who had once hurried past now stood frozen, their eyes locked on the chaotic scene unfolding in the parking lot. The sound of shouting mixed with the whir of phone cameras. Some filmed out of outrage, others out of morbid curiosity. In the corner booth of a nearby cafe, Special Agent Rebecca Lane sipped her coffee and watched silently through the glass. Dressed in a navy suit with her hair tied back, she blended in easily with the lunchtime crowd. But her eyes never left the 2 officers wrestling a terrified teen to the ground. She had seen hundreds of arrests in her career, but something about this one, the smirk on Sergeant Reynolds' face, the unnecessary aggression, the boy's panic, made her stomach twist. Rebecca was no stranger to injustice. As an agent with the FBI Civil Rights Division, She had spent years investigating police misconduct and evidence tampering, and she recognized both officers immediately. Reynolds, the department's golden boy, shielded by politics. Collins, a reckless follower who'd been cited twice for use of force beyond protocol. She had reviewed their names months ago in an internal investigation that mysteriously went quiet. Her eyes narrowed. She pulled out her phone and began recording from inside the cafe, zooming in on the officers' name tags. "Not this time," she whispered. Outside, the crowd gasped as Elijah's pink teddy bear fell from the bag. Reynolds' boot nudged it aside. Rebecca exhaled sharply. She knew this was no petty arrest. It was a violation wrapped in procedure. And she wasn't going to look away. At the police station, Elijah sat in a cold, gray interrogation room. The fluorescent lights flickered above him, the kind of hum that made time feel slower. His wrists were red from the zip ties. His backpack sat on the table beside a manila folder. Officer Collins leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, chewing gum like he had done this 100 times before. "All right, kid, let's make this simple." He tossed a crumpled form across the table. "Sign the confession, and you'll be home by morning." Elijah looked up, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Confession for what?" Reynolds entered, coffee in hand. "For the phone you stole, genius. We found it in your bag." Elijah frowned. "That's my phone. You can check the IMEI number. It's registered in my name." Reynolds chuckled. "Oh, he knows what an IMEI is. Must be guilty." Collins smirked. "You think you're smarter than us, huh? You people always think you can out-talk the system." Elijah swallowed hard, forcing back anger. "You made a mistake. Just check the receipt. It's in my pocket." Reynolds leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You listen to me, boy. You can either make this easy, or I'll make sure this sticks. You'll be lucky to get community service before the record follows you forever." Elijah stared at him, refusing to look away. "Then I guess I'll take forever to prove the truth." The tension in the room was suffocating. Collins scoffed. "Good luck with that." Meanwhile, Tanya Carter burst through the station doors, still wearing her nurse's scrubs. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her ID badge swinging against her chest. She approached the front desk, voice trembling but determined. "My son, Elijah Carter. He's 17. He was arrested outside the mall. Please, I need to see him." The officer at the desk didn't see her eyes. "Ma'am, you'll have to wait. He's still being processed." Tanya gripped the counter. "He's a minor. You can't question him without me or a lawyer present." Before she could finish, Collins stepped out from the hallway. His smirk returned like a bad habit. "Mrs. Carter, right? He's fine. I just need to answer a few questions. We'll release him once he cooperates." Tanya took a step forward. "My son doesn't need to cooperate with false accusations." Collins' expression darkened. "Careful, ma'am. You don't want to make this harder for him." Her voice cracked. "You already did." Behind her, a handful of civilians who had witnessed the arrest were gathered outside the glass windows, whispering, scrolling, and sharing. Their videos were already spreading across social media. The hashtags began forming. Yichu Justice for Elijah, Ishmael arrest, Yichu say, his name. Within an hour, the footage would reach thousands. The still frame of Elijah's face, scared, crying, his cheek pressed to the ground beside the pink teddy bear, became a digital outcry. Inside the interrogation room, Collins' phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowning. "What the hell?" Reynolds looked over. "What?" Collins turned the screen toward him. A headline glowed at the top. "Video of teen's violent arrest sparks outrage." Reynolds grunted. "Ignore it. It'll die down like the rest." But it wouldn't. Across the city, Agent Rebecca Lane sat in her car outside the station, her laptop open on the passenger seat. She was typing furiously, forwarding video evidence and officer IDs to Agent Marcus Hill, head of the FBI's corruption task force. Her message was simple. "Marcus, it's Reynolds and Collins again. Got them on video using force against an unarmed minor. The kid's clean. We need to move before they bury this one too." Within minutes, Hill replied, "On it." "Stay put. We're rolling out." Rebecca's heart pounded as she closed the laptop. She had worked with Hill before, a man who believed in the law but understood its flaws. If he said he was coming, it meant backup. She watched the precinct doors as rain began to fall. Each drop felt like a ticking clock. She knew how these cases went. Hours mattered. One wrong word in an interrogation could ruin a future forever. Back inside, Elijah sat silently, staring at his reflection in the one-way mirror. He could hear faint voices beyond the glass, Collins laughing, Reynolds complaining about media nonsense. He thought of his mother's voice. When the world pushes you down, don't shout. Stand taller. He straightened in his chair. Even in that cold, empty room, he refused to let them see him break. Outside, Tanya sat in the lobby with her head in her hands, unaware that a convoy of black SUVs was speeding down the highway toward the station. At the front desk, a young officer whispered nervously into the phone, "Captain, you might want to come down here." The feds just pulled up. The storm that had begun in a mall parking lot was about to break wide open. The first flash of blue lights wasn't from a patrol car. It came from a long line of black SUVs pulling up in front of the precinct. The engines hummed in unison, their presence heavy and deliberate. Doors opened in sequence. 10 men and women in dark suits stepped out, their badges catching the afternoon sun like shards of truth. Inside, Officer Collins leaned against the interrogation table, smirking. "Still sticking to your story, huh, kid?" Elijah didn't respond. His wrists were still bound. His eyes stared straight ahead. Sergeant Reynolds added, "Don't worry. A night in juvenile detention will loosen your memory." He leaned closer, whispering mockingly, "You'll thank us one day. We're teaching you how the real world works." The door slammed open. The sound cut through the station like thunder. Every head turned. A man in a gray suit stepped in. Broad-shouldered, calm, commanding. Behind him, 9 other agents fanned out across the room, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from arrogance to fear. Agent Marcus Hill held up his badge. Officers Derek Collins and Mike Reynolds, stand down. Reynolds blinked. "Excuse me?" Hill's voice was firm. "You heard me. Step away from the minor." Collins laughed. "This is a local matter, Agent. We've got it handled." Hill took a slow step forward, placing a folder on the table. "Not anymore." Reynolds reached for the file, but Hill opened it first, revealing photos, printed timestamps, and documents. Agent Rebecca Lane entered behind him, her heels echoing on the tile floor. She began placing evidence on the table one piece at a time, like puzzle pieces spelling out guilt. "Here's mall security footage," she said coldly, sliding a photo forward. "Elijah Carter paying for his items. Time-stamped, clear as day." She dropped another folder beside it. "And here's the original body cam data from your patrol car, and the edited version you uploaded after the arrest. Notice the gap. 92 seconds of footage mysteriously missing." Colin's smirk faltered. Reynolds clenched his jaw. Hill nodded to her. "Continue." Rebecca laid out a final set of papers. Internal emails printed in black and white. "And this," she said, tapping the top page, "is correspondence between you two discussing how to keep the kid quiet before anyone checks the footage." The room went silent. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded deafening. Every officer in the precinct who'd once looked up to Reynolds now avoided eye contact. Reynolds tried to speak. "You can't just—" Hill interrupted, his tone icy. "Actually, I can. Under federal jurisdiction, this falls under Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law." Before they could react, the door opened again. Tanya Carter stood there, trembling, tears streaking her face. Behind her, the front desk officer whispered to Hill, "She's the boy's mother." Hill turned to her and nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Carter, you can see your son now." Tanya crossed the room in seconds, dropping to her knees beside Elijah. She cradled his face, whispering through tears, "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" He shook his head weakly. "I'm okay, Mom." Every eye in the room watched as that simple reunion shattered what little authority the 2 officers had left. Hill turned to them. His voice carried the weight of every injustice he'd ever investigated. "You arrested an innocent minor, falsified evidence, and tried to bury it. You're both under federal investigation for civil rights violations." Reynolds opened his mouth to argue, but Hill's tone sharpened. "Don't bother. The evidence speaks for itself, just like the truth you tried to silence." Cameras flashed from the hallway as reporters began crowding into the lobby. The words FBI raid spread like wildfire across phones and social media. Officers from neighboring precincts stood frozen, unsure whether to help their disgraced colleagues or pretend they didn't know them. Collins looked around desperately. "You're making a mistake." Rebecca Lane crossed her arms. "No, officer." "You did." Two agents stepped forward, cuffing both men. The same plastic ties they'd once used on Elijah now bound their own wrists. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As they were led out of the room, Reynolds shouted, "This isn't over." Hill replied calmly, "You're right. It's only the beginning. For you." The agents marched them through the lobby. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Microphones waved in the air. Cameras clicked in a frenzy. And in the middle of it all, Elijah Carter, the boy once humiliated in public, now stood tall beside his mother. A voice in the crowd yelled, "That's the kid. That's the one they tackled." Phones pointed toward him again, but this time not in mockery. Hill placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong, son. Remember that." Elijah looked past him, eyes locking with Reynolds as the disgraced sergeant was pushed into an FBI vehicle. His voice was calm, measured, but every word carried the force of everything he'd endured. "You told me to keep my head down," he said quietly, "but I learned that truth only bows to justice." Reynolds turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Outside, protesters were already gathering, holding homemade signs. "Shew justice for Elijah. Shew accountability. Now. Truth rides with us." The roar of chants filled the air as cameras captured the scene. 2 officers in handcuffs, a mother's tears, and a boy who refused to break. Tanya stood beside Elijah, her arm around him. The FBI agents stood behind them like sentinels of truth. For the first time since that afternoon at the mall, Elijah lifted his head fully and faced the crowd. The humiliation that once burned in his chest was gone, replaced by quiet pride. Outside, under the glow of flashing lights and rolling cameras, the chants grew louder. "Justice for Elijah! Justice for Elijah!" And amid the storm of noise, Tanya whispered to her son, "You did it, baby. You made them see." The agents didn't speak. They didn't have to. The truth was standing right in front of them. Within hours of the arrest being overturned, the world knew Elijah Carter's name. The videos that had once circulated in outrage were now being replayed on national news channels, this time accompanied by a different headline: FBI steps in after teen, wrongfully arrested, justice served. Every network aired footage of the FBI agents storming the precinct, the dramatic moment when the cuffs were switched from the innocent to the guilty. News anchors called it the story that reignited America's conversation on accountability. Social media exploded with support. Celebrities shared the hashtag #Justice for Elijah, students held signs outside schools, and strangers flooded the Carter family's small mailbox with handwritten letters of encouragement. By midnight, the mayor called an emergency press conference. His face looked strained, his tone heavy with apology. "Effective immediately," he said. "Officers Derek Collins and Mike Reynolds are suspended without pay pending federal investigation. This department stands against corruption in all forms." It was the first public admission of failure in the city's history. For Tanya Carter, that night felt like breathing after nearly drowning. She sat on the couch beside Elijah, watching the coverage in silence. His hands were clasped, eyes fixed on the screen. When the reporter said his name, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "They see you now," she whispered. Weeks later, the world had not forgotten. Agent Rebecca Lane arrived quietly at Elijah's high school one morning. The principal's office buzzed with excitement as she stepped through the door holding a white envelope. Elijah stood as she entered, his uniform pressed, his eyes bright but humble. "Agent Lane," he said softly. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." She smiled. "I couldn't stay away. You changed more than you realize." She handed him the envelope. "This is for you." Inside was a letter embossed with a golden seal, an invitation to the National Youth Justice Conference, along with a scholarship in his name. Beneath it read, "Awarded to Elijah Carter, for courage in the face of injustice." He looked up, speechless. "I don't know what to say." Lane placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just survive, Elijah. You made the system look at itself. At home that evening, Tanya received a call from Elijah's history teacher. Her voice trembled with pride. "Mrs. Carter, your son's speech from the conference. It's gone viral. 500,000 views in 2 days." Tanya turned to look at Elijah sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling notes for his next class. A tear slipped down her cheek as she said, "He didn't just win. He made them listen." Meanwhile, in a downtown courthouse, Collins and Reynolds walked through a side entrance to avoid reporters. Cameras still found them. Their lawyers fumbled through statements about procedural errors and miscommunication, but the missing footage, falsified reports, and FBI testimony told the truth they couldn't hide. Both resigned before sentencing, their badges turned in, their reputations shattered. Back home, Elijah stood before the framed newspaper headline that hung on the wall. "Teens arrest, sparks FBI crackdown on police abuse." He stared at it for a long moment, the reflection of his face overlapping the print. The boy who had once been forced to the ground was now standing tall, not as a victim, but as proof that dignity, when tested, could still rise and roar. A year passed, and the story that began in a mall parking lot had reshaped an entire city. Elijah Carter was no longer just the teen from the viral video. He had become a symbol of awareness, courage, and transformation. What had once been pain had turned into purpose. At 18, Elijah founded the Carter Youth Rights Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to teaching teens how to handle police encounters, understand their legal rights, and speak up safely when injustice appeared. His first seminar, held in the same community center where he used to do homework after his cafe shifts, drew over 200 students. Within months, his message spread across the country. Schools invited him to speak. News outlets covered his workshops. His calm, grounded tone made people listen. "I'm not anti-police," he'd always begin. "I'm pro-truth." His speeches gathered millions of views online. Comment sections filled with parents thanking him, teachers calling him an example, and young people saying they finally felt seen. Despite the fame, Elijah stayed humble, still walking to the same cafe, still buying pink teddy bears for his sister, Amara, who kept the first one proudly on her shelf. Tanya Carter had her own moment of recognition. She was invited to speak at a national nursing conference about resilience and moral strength in hard times. Standing on the stage, hands trembling slightly, she told the story of the night she almost lost her son, and how faith and courage had carried them both through. Her closing words brought the entire room to its feet. "Courage isn't inherited," she said. "It's taught when no one's watching." Her line went viral, too. Hospitals printed it on bulletin boards. Schools used it in morning announcements. Across the city, reforms followed. The FBI's Civil Rights Task Force, the same one that had stepped in to save Elijah, expanded nationwide. Rivergate Mall, once the site of humiliation, became the site of reform. Its management partnered with advocacy groups to launch bias-free policing workshops, mandatory for all private security contractors. A year later, a new mural appeared on the wall beside the parking lot where it had all begun. It showed Elijah standing tall beside 2 FBI agents, sunlight behind them, his sister holding the pink teddy bear. The caption read, "Justice has eyes everywhere." As for Collins and Reynolds, they were both sentenced for falsifying evidence and obstruction of justice. Their names became shorthand for arrogance undone by truth, a reminder of how quickly power collapses when it forgets its purpose. One evening, Elijah took Amara to see the mural. She stared up at her brother's painted face glowing in the sunset. "Do you think they'll ever forget what they did?" she asked quietly. Elijah smiled, his reflection merging with the painted sky. "They don't have to," he said softly. "They just have to remember what came after. They thought tackling a young black teen would make them heroes. They thought the headlines would fade, the videos would vanish, and the truth would drown in silence. But they were wrong. The real heroes that day wore no badges, carried no weapons, and followed no orders, only their conscience. Courage came in the form of a trembling boy who refused to confess to a lie, a mother who refused to let fear define her, and 10 federal agents who remembered what justice was meant to protect. They tried to bury justice under fear, but it rose, flanked by those who refused to look away, armed not with guns, but with truth. Power without accountability is weakness. Real strength isn't measured by how loud someone can shout, or how much authority they hold. It's measured by the courage to stand up for someone who can't stand for themselves. If this story reminded you that truth doesn't need permission to speak, like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere, right now, another voice is being silenced, and your share might be the one that makes the world listen.